When white opens the game with d4, and black responds with knight f6, developing a piece and helping control the center, white's most ambitious choice is c4, grabbing more space while possibly preparing knight c3, which will then help grab more space in the center with e4. A flexible response for black is e6, supporting the d5 square while also opening up a diagonal for the dark squared bishop. If white continues with knight c3, then black can play bishop b4, pinning white's knight to the king and turning the game into the solid Bogo Indian defense. If you like to play the Bogo Indian as black, you also have to be prepared for openings such as g3 or knight f3. What exactly is a Bogo Indian player supposed to do when white doesn't play an early knight c3? Today we are going to examine the solid Bogo Indian defense, so even though white has avoided an early pin against the knight on c3, black can still develop the bishop to b4 with check. This disruptive check is known as the Bogo Indian defense, a solid partner with the Bogo Indian. Why are these two openings related? If black plays bishop b4 check, then black must be prepared to enter a Bogo Indian if white plays knight c3, the subject of another opening video. White is usually not too excited to transpose into a Bogo Indian with knight c3, especially as white enjoys less flexibility with the knight already committed on f3. This means that if white wants to avoid the Bogo, then white only has two options to consider: bishop d2 or knight b to d2. Let's first take a look at the direct bishop d2, blocking the check as well as offering a trade of dark squared bishops. After white's bishop moves to the somewhat awkward d2 square, it's possible for black to retreat the bishop with bishop e7, followed by striking in the center with d5. Instead of retreating the bishop, black can immediately exchange bishops with bishop takes d2 check. An interesting as well as instructive response for white is to play queen takes d2. By capturing with the queen, instead of the knight, white's knight on b1 can enter the game from the more active c3 square, helping control a greater share of the center. The Bogo Indian rapidly develops the king side, so black can already decide to castle. A sensible continuation for white is to play knight c3. The Bogo Indian enjoys great structural flexibility, as black has several ways to define the pawn structure. One idea is to play d6, preparing e5, a structure we will revisit later. Another path is to follow Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, who in the 2013 World Championship Candidates Tournament immediately grabbed more space in the center with d5, discouraging white's attempts to grab more space with e4, and also adding pressure against the c4 pawn. His opponent, Grandmaster Levon Aronian, supported the center with the solid e3, reinforcing the center while also revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of the c4 pawn. Carlsen continued with queen e7. In many of the lines we'll examine, black's queen is often well placed on e7. In this case, it supports the center and also clears the d8 square for a rook. If white decides to continue to focus on development with the straightforward bishop d3, black can gain a tempo against the light-squared bishop with d takes c4, bishop takes c4. This capture does remove a black pawn from the center, but it also opens up the d-file for a rook to add pressure against the d4 pawn. We can see another useful point behind queen e7, as it now supports the pawn break c5, adding pressure against d4, which can be intensified with knight c6 and rook d8, creating reasonable counterplay against white's center. Instead of playing bishop d3, Grandmaster Aronian decided to remain flexible with rook c1, supporting the c-file, which will likely open based upon the tension between the c4 and d5 pawns. Magnus continued with rook d8, supporting the center and x-raying white's queen on d2. White's queen will not be comfortable if black opens up the d-file with d takes c4, so Grandmaster Aronian decided to play queen c2, improving the placement of the queen while escaping the pressure from the d-file. Black decided to play a6, with the idea of playing d takes c4, followed by b5 and c5, creating plenty of interesting counterplay. Instead of playing queen c2, white can also consider the straightforward plan of c takes d5, stabilizing the center after e takes d5. Now that white no longer has to worry about a quick d takes c4, white can activate the light-squared bishop with bishop d3, preparing to castle the king. White enjoys a safe as well as comfortable position, but black's position remains quite solid. One idea for black is to reinforce the center with c6. A more active plan for black is to centralize the knight while restricting white's activity in the center with knight e4, although playing this immediately can encourage queen c2, creating unpleasant batteries with the bishop down the b1 to h7 diagonal, as well as with the rook on the c-file. Instead of playing knight e4 immediately, black can prepare this idea by first playing knight c6, so that queen c2 can be met with knight b4, forking the queen and bishop, so there are definitely plenty of resources to explore. Instead of deciding to exchange bishops with bishop takes d2 check, or retreating the bishop with bishop e7, white can decide to build the tension with moves such as c5, a5, or else play black's most popular choice, queen e7, centralizing the queen while supporting the dark-squared bishop. White typically activates the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal with g3. A useful developing move for black is knight c6, adding pressure against white's center, supporting the bishop on b4, and also preparing a future pawn break with e5. If white continues with bishop g2, fianchettoing the light-squared bishop, exerting pressure down the long diagonal, before white is able to castle, this is a good moment for black to exchange bishops with bishop takes d2 check. As we saw in the previous example, white often prefers to play queen takes d2, allowing white's knight to enjoy the more active c3 square. In this case, however, capturing the bishop with the queen is not a desirable choice. Since white hasn't castled yet, black can harass the enemy queen with knight e4, preparing to meet queen c2, with the disruptive queen b4 check. Unless white is willing to forfeit castling rights with king f1, then white will have to make a concession with a knight move, such as knight c3. This move allows black to gain a favorable endgame after the exchange's knight takes c3. Black's queen is ready to grab the c4 pawn, so white responds with queen takes c3, allowing a trade of queens with queen takes c3, b takes c3. White's doubled c-pawns, as well as the isolated a-pawn, will be a liability in the endgame, so this is an unpleasant position white should avoid. After the disruptive check on b4, instead of playing knight c3, white can also block the check with knight b to d2. When black overwhelms white's defenses with knight takes d2. If white responds with knight takes d2, this simply loses the d4 pawn. And if white plays queen takes d2, this simply loses a pawn to queen takes c4. Black is up a pawn, and white lacks sufficient compensation. Instead of playing the inaccurate queen takes d2, white can play knight b takes d2. White's knight helps control the center, although it would prefer to be more active from the c3 square. That being said, white's position remains quite solid, and white will prepare to grab more space in the center with e4. After exchanging dark-squared bishops, a useful continuation for black is d6, preparing to meet e4 with e5. After both sides castle, we see a typical central struggle in which white grabs more space with e4, and black strikes back in the center with e5, adding pressure against d4, so black invites white to grab more space with d5, gaining a tempo against the knight when black calmly retreats with knight b8. This is a typical Bogo Indian position that highlights the strategic nature of this opening. White does enjoy more space, but the pawns in the center restrict the mobility of the light-squared bishop. Black's central pawns, on the other hand, do the exact opposite. By trading dark-squared bishops and then placing the central pawns on dark squares, this strengthens black's light-squared bishop as it enjoys great scope on the h3 to c8 diagonal. In this position, white has two typical pawn breaks to keep in mind, c5 as well as f4. Black, on the other hand, can focus on the pawn breaks c6 and f5, adding pressure against white's center. If white decides to expand on the queen side with b4, hoping to support an eventual c5 pawn break, this is a good moment for black to strike back with a5, trying to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queen side. In response to a5, white does not want to move the b-pawn, which would weaken the c5 square, a great post for a black knight. So white can maintain the tension with a3. We see the strategic struggle unfold as black fights against white's queenside space advantage with knight a6. If white captures on a5, then black will play knight c5, adding pressure against white's center, as well as revealing the rook's attack against the pawn on a5. Instead of changing the pawn structure, white can support the contested b4 square with queen b3. Grandmaster Eugene Perelstein, a seasoned veteran of the Bogo Indian Defense, played the thematic pawn break c6, adding pressure against white's central d5 pawn, as well as opening up the c7 square for the knight if needed. His opponent, Grandmaster Aram Akobian, sent more forces to the queenside with rook f to c1. Black developed the bishop and connected the rooks with bishop d7. White continued with the plan of increasing control over the queenside with knight e1, preparing to centralize the knight with knight d3, helping support a potential pawn break with c5. Before white was able to complete his plan, Grandmaster Perelstein played the instructive sequence a takes b4, a takes b4, opening up the a-file, followed by striking against white's sensitive b4 pawn with c5. White marched forward with b5, when the knight invaded white's position with knight b4. The knight enjoys an excellent post on b4 while opening up tension on the a-file. Although white enjoys a space advantage, it's difficult to make any progress in this closed position. In response to knight b4, white offered a trade of knights with knight d3, when after additional simplifications, the game ended in a draw. Instead of expanding on the queenside immediately, white can play more flexibly with knight e1. Centralizing the knight on d3 is a useful positional maneuver. From the d3 square, it supports two pawn breaks, c5 and f4. Black's knight on b8 is often redeployed on the a6 square, preparing to centralize with knight c5 when possible. One way to support this plan while grabbing space on the queenside is a5, discouraging a quick b4, so this helps support the maneuver knight a6 to c5. In one Grandmaster encounter on chess.com, Grandmaster Dmitry Andreikin, known for his creative attacking style, immediately confronts Black's center as well as prepares a kingside initiative with f4. His opponent, Norwegian Grandmaster Shadow Lee, developed his knight with the familiar knight a6. Knight d3 is a popular choice, but Andreikin grabbed more space on the kingside with f5. White is preparing a kingside pawn storm with g4 and g5, so Black countered this flank attack by adding pressure against White's center with c6. White's pawn marched forward with g4. It definitely can be intimidating to face White's kingside pawn storm, especially in the all-too-capable hands of Grandmaster Andreikin, but Grandmaster Lee calmly responded with c takes d5, opening up the c-file while adding additional pressure against the e4 pawn. So White responded with c takes d5. Allowing White to march forward with g5 and f6 definitely looks like a recipe for disaster, so Black discouraged g5 by playing h6. Grandmaster Andreikin didn't have to be asked twice to continue to charge forward on the kingside, and he played h4, renewing the threat of g5. So Black's knight assumes an instructive defensive crouch with knight h7, joining Black's queen and h6 pawn in discouraging g5, while also revealing the queen's attack against the unprotected h4 pawn. Since the h4 pawn is now hanging, White continued with knight e to f3. Supporting the h4 pawn, as well as dreaming of g5. Playing the Bogo Indian as Black can be a delicate balancing act. Black's defenses may often have to bend, but as long as they do not break, there is usually the opportunity to find sufficient counterplay. In this case, Black has set up a resilient defense to White's kingside initiative, and as White struggles to make progress on that side of the board, this gives Black the chance to find counterplay on the queen side. One interesting option was to improve the position of the knight with knight c5, but Black preferred to first complete development with bishop d7. When White centralized the queen with queen e2, Black was able to first occupy the open c-file with rook f to c8. Black suddenly enjoys active counterplay on the queen side, and after many adventures, the game ended in a draw, although from this sharp position, you can easily imagine this was anything but a lifeless draw. Instead of allowing Black to exchange dark square bishops after bishop g2, a popular alternative is knight c3, activating the knight and helping control the center. Black's dark-squared bishop does not have many options for activity, so Black usually exchanges it with bishop takes c3 and bishop takes c3. White temporarily enjoys the bishop pair, and the position can become quite dangerous if White can open the position with d5. But Black can prepare to remove the dark-squared bishop with knight e4. Since the bishop pair cannot be preserved, White anticipates the exchange with rook c1, developing the rook, preparing to increase its activity after knight takes c3 and rook takes c3. Once again, a solid plan for black is to build the dark squared central structure with d6, preparing the pawn break e5. Grandmaster Ding Liren, playing white, shows the disruptive, space-gaining pawn thrust d5, attacking the knight in central e-pawn while opening up the dark squared bishop's pressure against the g7 pawn. His opponent, Grandmaster Rihard Report, exchanged this dangerous piece with knight takes c3. Rook takes c3. Black is under some pressure and needs to stay alert, as e takes d5 opens up the e-file, inviting an unpleasant rook e3, adding pressure against the queen and king. Since capturing the pawn on d5 is not a good decision, the question is where to place the knight. If black decides to play knight b8, we've already seen how this knight can return to the action with knight a6 and knight c5. And the flexible knight d7 is also an interesting option to consider, but white is able to respond with d takes e6. Black should consider capturing with the f-pawn when white enjoys straightforward development in a slightly more comfortable position, because if black plays bishop takes e6, this allows white to play knight d4, adding pressure against the bishop, which may later intensify with rook e3. The knight also clears the long diagonal for bishop g2, adding serious pressure against black's queenside. Since d takes e6 can be an unpleasant move to face, Grandmaster Report played the strange-looking but positionally justified knight d8, supporting the e6 pawn and preparing to meet d takes e6 with knight takes e6. The game continued with the sensible moves bishop g2 and castling kingside. e5 is an interesting option for black, so white played d takes e6. Black's knight returns to the action with knight takes e6, when white castled the king to safety. Black developed the bishop and connected the rooks on the back rank with bishop d7, when Grandmaster Ding prepared to expand in the center with rook e1. True to his dynamic style, not afraid of accepting some danger in order to provoke complications, Rapport played rook a to b8, preparing to mix things up with a b5 pawn break. Black was under some pressure during the game, but ultimately held Ding to a draw. If black decided to play the solid bishop c6, contesting the long light-squared diagonal, white was ready to meet this with e4. White enjoys a central space advantage, and if allowed, white will likely expand on the queen side with b4. If black decides to prevent this idea with a5, then one interesting option is knight h4, preparing to invade black's position with knight f5, creating an active position. White's position may feel slightly more comfortable to play, although black's position does remain relatively solid. In response to the Bogo Indian, bishop d2 is the most popular continuation, but a strong alternative to keep in mind is knight b to d2. The knight accepts a slightly less active role on d2, but it also prevents black from exchanging dark-squared bishops, so if black wants to trade the dark-squared bishop, it will come at the price of giving white the two bishops. Black has a wide variety of options to explore, including striking in the center with c5 or d5. One solid path for black is to play b6, fighting for control over the long light-squared diagonal before white can complete a kingside fianchetto. White's most ambitious choice is to claim the bishop pair with a3. Since bishop e7 would allow white to take over the center with e4, black usually surrenders the bishop pair with bishop takes d2 check. Although bishop takes d2 is certainly possible, a more popular choice is to play queen takes d2. White's idea is to grab more space on the queen side with b4, preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. A typical continuation is bishop b7, when white supports the center and prepares kingside development with e3. White is not especially worried about bishop takes f3, because after g takes f3, although this capture does slightly compromise white's pawn structure, it allows rook g1, adding pressure against black's kingside, which is typically where black prefers to castle the king. White is also confident in the long-term potential of the bishop pair versus black's knights. Instead of this exchange, black typically castles. White can support the knight on f3 while preparing to castle with bishop e2. Black can now control more space in the center while preparing to develop the queenside knight with d6. Both sides continue their plans by castling and centralizing the knight with knight b to d7, supporting the other knight, as well as the possible pawn breaks e5 and c5. White grabs more space on the queen side with b4. Black sometimes strikes at white's queenside with a5. Another option is to centralize the queen with queen e7. But black's most direct response is knight e4. Leaping into the center, which not only attacks white's queen, it also prepares to grab more space with f5. White sensibly moves the queen to c2, adding pressure against the knight on e4, so black reinforces this piece while grabbing space with f5. White's dark-squared bishop enters the game with bishop b2. Thanks to playing f5, black may consider a future rook lift with rook f6 and rook h6, adding pressure against white's kingside. Black has to consider the central pawn breaks c5 and e5. Black also has to consider striking on the queenside with a5, preparing to open up the a-file with a takes b4. White also has several ideas to consider, including knight e1, preparing to dislodge the enemy knight with f3. Since black played f5, this leaves the e6 pawn open to attack, so a thematic pawn break is d5, attacking the loose e6 pawn while opening up the long dark square diagonal for white's bishop. If you're looking for ways to avoid simplifications in the Bogo Indian as white, this is definitely a line worth your attention, although black is certainly not without resources as well. Instead of playing knight f3, white players who prefer to play the Catalan may choose the move order g3, preparing a quick kingside fianchetto when d5 would transpose into the Catalan opening. This move order can also be inconvenient for Queen's Indian players who prefer to respond to knight f3 with b6 on the third move. g3, however, is not a problem for the Bogo Indian, as black can simply play bishop b4 check. White often responds with bishop d2, typically transposing to other lines we've already examined, but white can also play knight d2. As is usually the case in the Bogo Indian, black has no shortage of moves, including the immediate d5, when the game takes on a Catalan flavor. Since the knight on d2 blocks the queen's protection of the d4 pawn, one active idea for black is to strike in the center with c5. White is able to claim the bishop pair with a3, provoking the exchange as bishop takes d2 check. Queen takes d2. Grandmaster Sergei Karyakin, playing black, continued with c takes d4, trading a flank or non-center pawn for white's central d4 pawn. His opponent, Grandmaster Anish Giri, continued to develop and added pressure against this pawn with knight f3. White will soon regain the pawn on d4, but in the meantime, black took the opportunity to strike in the center with d5, grabbing space as well as provoking central tension, a position the interested viewer is encouraged to explore. When white avoids playing an early knight c3, if you're looking for a solid response to complement your Nimzo Indian repertoire, then the Bogo Indian is a safe, reliable choice. In many cases, white is able to achieve a space advantage, trying to achieve stable, slight advantages upon which to build. That being said, the Bogo is not an easy opening to break down, especially as black has so many interesting pawn structures to consider. If you enjoy playing positional games that are typically not overly theoretical, when knowledge regarding the typical pawn structures and ideas are more important than memorizing lines, after reviewing this video, perhaps a quick bishop b4 check will be seen more often in your games, right here on chess.com.